Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video I asked the question, is the global temperature record credible? Almost all of climate science is dependent on the accuracy of temperature graphs like this one from the NASA website. The graph shows different temperature series from 5 different organizations around the world. It shows that they're all fairly similar. All of them show fairly steady warming since about 1910. The idea behind this graph is that there's been a lot of warming over the last 110 years, and that all of the people studying it are in close agreement about that. This graph looks like pretty compelling evidence for global warming, particularly since about 1970. Well, let's take a closer look at the data now and see how valid these graphs really are. These graphs purport to show temperatures over the entire planet, including the land and the ocean. But until about 15 years ago, no one even attempted to plot ocean data prior to 1950 because there just isn't much data available prior to that time. So in this video, I'm going to focus on the land-only temperature data, which is much more extensive. This is the current NASA land-only temperature graph from the year 1880 to the year 2000. It shows a fairly steady warming of about 1 degree. But if we look at the same NASA temperature graph from 15 years ago, we see something very different. In the year 2000, NASA showed less than half a degree warming prior to the year 2000, and now they show a full degree warming. I'm going to flip back and forth a few times between the 2000 version and the 2017 version. 2000, 2017, 2000, 2017. You can see that they've altered the data quite a bit over the last 17 years, and that they've doubled the amount of warming present in their graphs. So we can see that NASA temperature graphs don't even agree with older NASA temperature graphs. Now let's look at how much NASA has changed the data since the year 2000. This graph shows the difference between the current NASA temperature graph and the one from the year 2000. You can see that they've cooled the past by quite a bit, almost half a degree, and then they've steadily warmed the present by about 0.2 degrees. So this changes the data quite a bit and increases the amount of warming going on just by altering the data. When you see large changes to the data like this, which very conveniently enhance their global warming theory, you should probably get a little bit suspicious. And perhaps even be more suspicious about the close agreement between these 5 different graphs, given that NASA doesn't even agree with NASA from 15 years ago. Now let's go back a little bit further and compare NASA's current land-only temperature graph with the one from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 1974. The NCAR graph showed that all of the warming which occurred from 1870 to 1940 was lost between 1940 and 1970. But the NASA graph shows nothing of the sort. It shows fairly steady warming from 1880 to 1970. They don't show any of this cooling from 1940 to 1970. So let's look a little closer at this now and see which one of the two graphs is correct. Did this post-1940 cooling, which NASA has erased, actually exist? Well, there's very compelling evidence that the post-1940 cooling did exist, and the NCAR graph was correct and the NASA graph was wrong. In 1961, the New York Times reported a unanimous consensus of scientists that the world was cooling. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It's getting colder. And by 1979, the cooling was indisputable. One thing is indisputable. The world has been cooling off since World War II. Dr. Murray Mitchell of NOAA says the world has been cooling off in the long run. On average, it's cooled down something like 1 degree Fahrenheit or half a degree Celsius, and that the cooling began around World War II. In 1970, the New York Times reported that the US and Soviet Union were worried about ominously thickening ice and the onset of a new ice age. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. In 1963, it was reported by the Canberra Times that Norway's glaciers were growing thicker for the first time in 200 years. That sounds a lot like cooling. In 1975, the Chicago Tribune reported that it's getting colder and there might be a new ice age on the way. He said in the last decade the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. So it was probably the coldest time in the past century. Then the article went on. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. In 1974, The Guardian reported, "Space satellites show new ice age coming fast." On March 1st, 1975, Science News had a picture of glaciers crushing New York City, and the headline was, "The Ice Age Cometh." The three coldest winters in U.S. history occurred in 1977, 1978, and 1979. In 1979, I went skiing at Flagstaff, Arizona, and the snow was 12 feet deep. 12 feet of snow in Arizona is pretty amazing, and there was almost that much snow in Buffalo during the winter of 1977. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And then they fired off a letter to President Nixon warning that there could be a new ice age within 100 years. So as we can see, there is pretty compelling evidence that the world cooled a lot from 1940 to 1970, and NASA has simply erased that cooling. Both NCAR and NASA showed a lot of warming from 1880 to 1940. Let's take a closer look at that. In 1922, the U.S. consul to Norway reported, "The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared." And then they said last winter the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. It must have been very warm back then. This report from the U.S. consul in 1922 was widely reported by newspapers around the world. Here's one of those articles which says essentially the same thing. "The Arctic Ocean is warming up, icebergs are growing scarce, and in some places the seals are finding the waters too hot. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers," he declared, "all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic. Many points well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared." By 1939 it was even warmer. "All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that these glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse." This was reported by Professor Hans Allman, who was the leading authority on the Arctic at the time. In 1952, the leading U.S. authority, Dr. William Carlson, reported that the glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. He said the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. And 60 years ago, the New York Times reported, "The changing face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago. That even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole." But the weather changed dramatically after the 1950s, and by 1961, remember, the New York Times reported a unanimous consensus among scientists that the Earth was cooling, and by 1970, the US and Soviet Union were worried about ominously thickening ice and a new ice age. Let's compare side by side the 1958 New York Times article with the 1970 article. In 1958, they were predicting that their children would be able to sail over an ice-free North Pole. By 1970, they were afraid they were going to freeze to death in an ice age. So we know for sure that this post-1940 cooling was very real, and that NASA has erased it, showing us that their data set is fake. We can see right on the NASA website how NASA has tampered with the temperature data in the Arctic. This is the temperature graph for Reykjavik, Iceland. You can see that it was very warm around 1940, it cooled a lot down in 1979, and then warmed back up again since then. Now let's look at the Reykjavik temperatures after NASA tampers with it. Look at this warmth in the 1940s. Well, they simply erased that. This is before tampering, after tampering. Before tampering, after tampering. You can see that NASA's changed a cyclical weather pattern of warming and cooling into a linear trend upwards. We know that the raw data is accurate because remember in the 1970s, Iceland's ports were blocked for the first time in the century with ice. NASA has simply erased Iceland's climate history by tampering with the data. So yes, the NASA temperature data is fake. They've erased the post-1940 cooling. Let's look a little closer at exactly what they're doing. The first problem is that there's very little good long-term temperature data outside of the United States. This graph shows the number of stations in the Global Historical Climatology Network from 1891 to 1920 with daily temperature data. You can see that almost all of the good data is in the United States, a little bit in Europe and a little bit in parts of Australia. There's really very little high-quality daily temperature data outside of the United States going back into the past. And daily temperature data is very important because that's all that thermometers can measure. They measure temperatures one day at a time. They can't measure a temperature over a period of a month. This map shows all of the Global Historical Climatology Network stations with daily temperature data in 1880. See that there was none in South America, almost none in Africa, almost none in Russia or Asia. Pretty much the United States, parts of Europe, and parts of Australia was it. It was a little better by the year 1900. There were more stations in the United States, a few across Russia, a few more in Australia. But for the most part, it was still the same problem. The data was much too sparse in the year 1900 to make a meaningful assessment of the global temperature. You can see how bad the situation was in 1940. The United States had excellent coverage, but outside of the United States there was very little coverage across the rest of the Americas. Only one or two stations in South America, a handful in Mexico, and a handful in Canada. And the same problem on the other side of the pond. Almost no coverage in Africa, Saudi Arabia, and very sparse coverage across most of Europe and Asia. Some groups claim to have better coverage with the monthly data, but remember there's no such thing as a monthly thermometer. Thermometers measure temperatures one day at a time, and you have to be very suspicious when people claim to have monthly temperature data, but no daily temperature data to back it up. And this was reported in newspapers. 40 years ago, the New York Times said, International team of specialists finds no end in sight to the 30-year cooling trend in the Northern Hemisphere. And then they went on to say, data from the Southern Hemisphere, particularly south of latitude 30 south, are so meager that reliable conclusions are not possible. And yet we see all these 5 different agencies claim that they know the temperatures there now, when the data doesn't actually exist. In 1989, a very interesting report came out of NOAA. Analysis of warming since 1881 shows that most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Thomas Carl of NOAA. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Carl said. Well, none of the current temperature graphs show the 1921 to 1979 cooling. Remember that the current temperature graphs eliminated the 30-year cooling after the 1950s, and that's what accounts for the discrepancy. And then this last paragraph is really interesting. In spite of all the well-publicized concern about global warming, you must understand that there is still considerable uncertainty among scientific experts. So all of these Exxon new lawsuits which are currently being litigated against oil companies have no basis. There was considerable uncertainty in the scientific community. Scientists didn't know then, and they don't know now either. But this story gets worse. In a ClimateGate email, Phil Jones of the Climatic Research Unit in England said, for much of the southern hemisphere between 40 and 60 south, the temperature normals are mostly made up as there's very little ship data there. So these scientists are actually just making data up. And they're still making data up. This animation is flashing back and forth for September 2018 NOAA temperature data. In one map you can see that they're showing record heat in Saudi Arabia. In the other map you can see that it's gray, meaning missing data. So NOAA is declaring record heat and turning their map very red in places where they didn't actually have any temperature data. You can see all that gray area? That indicates missing data. So most of this red coloring which they're putting on their map is fake. Now let's look at the one place on Earth which has really good long-term daily temperature data, and that's the United States. Let's see how NOAA hacks the U.S. temperature record. The blue line shows the actual measured temperatures, and you can see that it was hotter in the 1930s than it has been, and that generally temperatures have declined since the 1930s. But the red graph is the temperatures which NOAA releases to the public, and they show a fairly steady warming since 1895. So NOAA is turning an actual measured post-1930 cooling into a fairly strong warming just by tampering with the data. This graph shows the extent of NOAA U.S. temperature tampering. You see that they cool the past by about 1 degree and they warm the present in this hockey stick of data tampering. All of the post-1930 warming being shown by NOAA in their temperature graph is due to data tampering. The actual measured thermometer data shows that the U.S. has been cooling generally since the 1930s. Here's another 1989 NOAA report reported in the New York Times. After examining climate data extending back nearly 100 years, a team of government scientists has concluded that there's been no significant change in average temperature or rainfall in the United States over that entire period. No climate change. The study was made by NOAA. No climate change certainly doesn't fit the current narrative, so NOAA has altered the data to make it look like the United States has been warming since 1895. In 1999, NASA's James Hansen, the guy who scared the country with the global warming scare in 1988, testifying before Congress, was very concerned about the fact the U.S. temperatures were cooling since the 1930s, which didn't match what he said the global temperatures were. So he decided to do something about it. He simply altered the U.S. temperature data. This animation flashes back and forth between the NASA 1999 U.S. temperature graph and the current one. You can see that in 1999 the U.S. cooled from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century, but they've since altered the graph to create warming during that period. 1999 cooling, 2017 warming, cooling, warming, cooling, warming. The data has been altered massively. And one thing which very few people remember is how much hotter the U.S. used to be in the summer than it is now. This graph shows the frequency of 95-degree days during the summer at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. That's 1,218 stations scattered around the United States. You can see the 1930s were much hotter. In 1936, 34% of summer days were over 95 degrees. Now we typically have less than 15%. You can see that the frequency of hot days has plummeted in the United States over the last century. This shouldn't surprise anyone who's read Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. The 1930s was extremely hot, and millions of people had to flee the Midwest and move out to California to become migrant farm workers. It was just too hot and dry in the Great Plains for people to survive there. So when NASA and NOAA claim that the United States is getting hotter, it simply isn't true. They're erasing U.S. history by altering our temperature graphs. In George Orwell's novel 1984, he wrote about the Ministry of Truth, a government agency whose job was to rewrite history in order to suit the current government narratives. Well, that's exactly what we're seeing from NASA and NOAA. The Ministry of Truth's motto was, "He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past." So far we've just been talking about thermometers on the surface, but now let's look at satellite temperatures. The graph we're seeing now is from remote sensing systems Carl Mears from a few years ago. It showed how temperatures were far below what the climate models were predicting. Yellow was the climate model predictions, and blue showed the actual measured tropospheric temperature data. You see that since about 1998 there's been no warming in the troposphere, whereas climate models in yellow predicted a lot of warming. Dr. Mears wrote, "Note that after 1998 the observations are likely to be below the simulated values, indicating the simulation as a whole are predicting too much warming." Dr. Mears was coming under incredible pressure from the climate community because his data didn't match the global warming narrative. So 3 years ago, I predicted that he would give in to the pressure and alter his data. I said that he would just rotate his graph to the left and turn the non-warming trend into a warming trend. And that's exactly what happened. Here's Dr. Mears' current graph. You can see that he's moved the black line up into the yellow area. It's still generally below the climate models, but he's moved it up quite a bit. Now he says there's a small discrepancy between the model predictions and the satellite observations. Apparently that's good enough for him to get the climate thugs off his back. Now let's look at the two graphs overlaid on top of each other. You can see what Dr. Mears did. The black line was the current line and the blue area was the range which he'd shown previously. He moved everything up to the top of his error range. I guess a man does what he has to do to keep his career alive, even if it's really bad science. Now let's go back and look at the graph which I started all this with, purporting to show all 5 agencies getting very close agreement on the temperatures. Well, we can see how fake all this is. There's very little historical coverage around most of the planet, and the one place which has really good temperature data, the United States, has been massively altered. The fact that all 5 of these agencies came up with such similar graphs tells me that there's been collusion, there's been thuggery, there's been groupthink, and the one thing there hasn't been has been good science. Global warming is a multi-billion-dollar business and it's completely corrupted the science. All of climate science depends on the accuracy of these temperature graphs from these government agencies. As we can see, these temperature graphs are really meaningless, and that corrupts huge amounts of science downstream from them. But even worse than the science being corrupted is that public policy and politics is also being corrupted by these fake temperature graphs. President Eisenhower warned us about this in his farewell speech in 1960. He said, "Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospects of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovering respect as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific and technological elite." Well, President Eisenhower definitely got that right, and that's exactly what happened. A small group of people corrupting the data or controlling public policy. We need to put an end to this. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.